The response to the Conor Gallagher Show has been humbling and overwhelming. Thank you for your support, and I want to give back, right? So we're going to give away 1,000 copies of this little gem right here, The Battle of Virtues and Vices. And it's a glorious little book written by a medieval pope named St. Leo IX. When you come to the website, tambooks.com, use the coupon code CGS1000. CGS1000. Why? Giving 1,000 copies away. And while you're there, check out the book by our guest on the show today, Father Basil Cole. His book is called Angelic Virtues and Demonic Vices. Powerful, inspiring. It's an amazing book, just like it's going to be an amazing episode. Thank you for your support, and God bless you.
There's a lot of conflict in the church right now. There's a lot of unrest. It's a tense and difficult time. How do you respond to all that? How do you see this?
The first thing we have to keep in mind is the overarching force of divine providence. We don't understand the why and the wherefore of divine providence, allowing crazy things to be said, crazy things to be done, and all this stuff. Why, Lord? Why do we have to deal with all this? He's not telling us why. He's simply telling us, trust me. If you come to confession and say, I am sorry for my sins and I hope to do better in the future, how do you hope to do better in the future? You remain in the state of grace by living a penitential life. Prayer, works of mercy. If you're a mom and a dad, you're doing works of mercy all the time with your kid. You're also doing penance when you cut back on the booze and the wines and the food and, eat simply and all that stuff. Not just one, but all three are the principal means of penance. Since we're bodily creatures, we necessarily want material things. A lot, excessively, too much. But if you don't have an understanding of the ultimate goal, then you won't have an understanding of why you should want to be holy, let alone what holiness is.
Not that I want to go to confession here on the air, but
don't.
I'm not.
This is not the place.
I'm not. I promise. Father, I am amazed that you're 87 years old, and I've already said that to you a couple of times in our short visit here. But I mean, very, very few people at that age are as sharp and energetic as you are.
I know. God gave me the gift. Okay.
It's amazing. Now, I do want. I wanted to start with a very specific question. What is heaven like? Now, I'm only 45, but the older I get, the more I think about it. So I don't know if an 87-year-old thinks about it even more than a 45-year-old. But you have researched everything in Aquinas. You've thought and written about so many things, and you begin your masterful book with kind of an explanation of heaven. But what is heaven gonna be like?
Okay. We can start with a negative idea. It's beyond our expectations. That's one way to start looking at it. Theologically, it's the beatific vision of the soul and eventually of the body. So as a human, we will experience infinite goodness, truth, and beauty, infinite love, infinite everything. We have anything we can think about that's perfection and beauty. That's all God and more, because our words are based on the senses, and our knowledge is weak compared to the reality we're talking about. Okay, so that in turn produces into our soul a certain tremendous fulfillment that doesn't take place in time, but outside time, and goes on forever and ever. That's on the level of purely of the beatific vision. And then we could say that All the goodness that you desire is found in the infinite goodness of God. All the beauty you love is in the beauty of God. All the truth that you desire is the truth of God, and yet they're all one. And it resonates totally in your being.
Was it Saint Anselm with his ontological argument? I think somewhere in that
God is beyond that which we can understand. Something like that.
There you go. And it's basically all perfections. That's how I kind of remember that.
Yeah, that's true. However, from our point of view, then, we also have the delight of giving back to God our love, giving back to God our praise, giving back to God our gratitude, giving back forever and ever. Just constant ecstasy of thanksgiving and praise and love and friendship, those words imply on the human level. Now, qua body, there's little extra bonuses that we also give, because we'll be able to, first of all, sing, dance, play, travel, walk, and desire to go anywhere. And then we'll have billions of people we can talk to, starting with the ones that we loved here on earth, and talking to each individual angel, the billions of them, our own guardians, for example, or there may be other angels that helped us all the way, the Blessed Mother, Saint Joseph, the saints, etc. And so there's no time limit here. This goes on forever and ever. You never can exhaust. Let's say by the time you finally finish with the very last angel you've met, because each angel is sui generis, is unique,
own nature.
Has its own nature, has its own beauty. I mean, the least angel is probably more beautiful than anything we can imagine on this earth, let alone the highest seraphim, the most beautiful. So by the time you finish meeting everybody, you've only begun heaven, to use the language of a Jesuit concerning hell. You just begun, and you can start all over again on the purely the bodily, the fact that we are body and soul, and yet never losing the delight of the beatific vision and communicating with God and praising Him and thanking Him and receiving messages from Him and aspiration, thanksgivings from Him, or whatever He does to communicate to us, like He does in this life. In this life, He gives us gifts and graces, etc. Well, in the next life, He gives us Himself, and what that all means transcends beyond our poor, weak human intellect.
So what's the experience different before we get our glorified bodies, right? So we're a soul in heaven, and are you having friendships up there? Are they talking, communicating, but then the body shows up, and how's it change?
It would appear from what our understanding of angelic, how the angels, the angels communicate not by voice. They communicate and the word that St. Thomas uses is by a nod. Somehow that means they want to find out something from one, and then that angel can answer or not, depending on God's will, actually. And so I would imagine that we'll be kind of like that. We won't be like I'm talking to you now, words, etc. I don't know if I'll be throwing concepts to you like the angels do. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. I don't think we can kind of know that, but that there can be some communication, yeah. Mm-hmm. Recognition, yeah. Joy in the presence. You're my mother. Here's my father. Hi. But are we going to be? Yeah. What happened in 1935? I don't think we'll be doing that so much. We might. I just don't know. That's part of the mystery.
Likewise, there's so many more questions I want to ask about the glorified body and heaven. So when you get your body back, that's at the same time. Is that going to be at the same time that there's a new heaven and a new earth?
Yes, that's the concept. We only get it back when the final coming. Now, the process of that happening, I would imagine, once the earth is renewed, destroyed, whatever, and the stars, everything, the whole universe is remade, because this way we'll enjoy it together with them in a new way too. Because we have a new happiness that'll be reflected in the macroscopic universe in some way, it would seem. Okay, so then once our bodies come back to our souls, then the judgment takes place, and some don't make it, and some do, and then the heaven with body and soul commences. Now, you're already in heaven, even though you don't have your body, and it's still at the end of the world. And then the minute you get your body, that just simply doesn't make the beatific vision more beatific, but it makes you more integral, because you're now enjoying God as a human and not as a separated soul.
What does a new heaven and new earth refer to? The new earth, I mean...
Somehow this globe, which is beautiful and good, will somehow be raised up even further to its beauty and goodness.
Glorified?
Yeah, that's what glorification would mean.
Including animals?
It would appear that animals won't exist if you follow St. Thomas. Their purpose is over. Their purpose is finished. Do you have to hold with Aquinas in that? Probably not. Mm-hmm. There's probably opinion, because it's never been defined.
Sure.
It's just a matter of good theological opinion, but there's no, they're not called to heaven. They're not called to beatific vision. So it would appear they're not necessary for our happiness, let alone for their existence.
The way you describe heaven in your book and here just now, it's actually very reassuring to me, because when I hear the notions of ecstasy, I think of somebody kind of frozen, staring at the beatific vision and just enraptured, and like not even noticing what's going on next to them. If somebody's in ecstasy, they're not going to know what's going on around them. But this sounds very dynamic, a dynamic thing, and somehow we're able to experience the beatific vision, but then also be completely aware and embrace all those friends and families and everybody you just mentioned.
It would seem that we would have many divisions of consciousness, at the same time, like angels. How does your guardian angel? He looks out for you, at the same time he has the beatific vision. How can you explain that? Right. He has maybe 2 levels of consciousness. I don't know. Right. Then once he's through with you, then he goes back to heaven per se. Then after that, we don't know what he does. There's a lot more what we don't know than we do know.
You mentioned in a previous conversation we had that priest would be well served to preach more about heaven. Tell me a little bit about that, since we're on the topic.
Well, if you're going to aim for holiness, then you have to kind of know the goal. What's your goal here? If I want to be a good CEO, I have to kind of know my business. I have to kind of know what business ethics is. I have to kind of know what business practices are. I have to know how to deal with people that are living, that are working under me. And so I have to know purposes. Now, if I don't have a long understanding purpose of my ultimate goal, why should I want to go there?
Yeah. Why
should I want to be there? And then if it's so kind of vague, well, then I'll live my life vaguely in this life. But if I have a fairly robust understanding of my ultimate goal, and that I could screw it up and throw it out and go to damnation, then that will mean that I'll make sure that I try to fulfill my happiness in this life with virtue and trusting in God's word and trying to find being close to our Lord. That's all it's about. But if you don't have an understanding of the ultimate goal, then you won't have an understanding of why you should want to be holy, let alone what holiness is. So it's sort of like the sun that enlightens everything else in your life, intellect and will.
Tell us a little bit about, we got plenty more to get into about the virtues and vices in your book and everything, and eventually we talked about heaven, I want to get back to hell, but tell us a little bit about your own vocation. How did you become a Dominican? How did you I mean, you've become a great scholar, well recognized in so many ways. How did Father Basil become Father Basil?
Well, I would say that at a certain point in my high school life, I was educated in San Francisco at St. Ignatius, together with Jerry Brown, the former governor.
Really?
We were debate team partners. Anyway, that's another story. So anyway, it was in that point, I guess my senior year, I thought maybe I should become a Jesuit father, because they were, they were attractive, but mostly it was Jesuit scholastics.
And this would have been when?
1959.
Oh, okay.
No, right, 1955.
Wow.
And then I decided to go to college and get a degree. And then when I met the Trappist monks in Vina, California, all of a sudden I saw something I had never seen before in a religious or a priest. And there was something very human, very ordinary. I wasn't looked down at by my professors. I was like with equals, the brothers and the priest. And that kind of struck me very deeply. And at the same time, I said, I couldn't be one of these guys. I love them to death, but I can't be a farmer. I don't have the stuff. I can't get up at midnight and start praying up a storm. I just can't do a thing like that. Is there no place for me? Then I thought, well, maybe the next best thing might be to be a Benedictine. So I went up to Mount Angel thinking maybe that would take place. And then I got there and I immediately, I don't think I belong here either, and I don't know why. And then I read a book on the failure of the religious orders, written by a guy who didn't like any of us. And as I went through the various communities, when it came to the Dominicans, I said, but I think I could live that kind of a life, even though they're imperfect. I think I could live with that kind of imperfect because I'm an intellectual. I like to read. I like to think. I can't be a farmer. I don't like to simply pray all day either. I can't be, talking to God. I get bored doing all that stuff. So anyway, that led me to, and then I met a Dominican father who was the chaplain to a prison, and I used to help him out there. And together with that, you might say, I entered the order. And my first year as a novice was awful. It was just terrible. I hated every minute of it.
And where was it, in D.C.?
No, it was in Marin County, in Ross, California. They call it by a different name now.
And your novitiate was terrible.
Oh, it was awful. It was awful. It was awful.
And what year? This would have been late 50s?
1960, 61. Okay. But I learned by that it was me that was awful, but I was a jazz musician, for heaven's sakes.
Really?
That was
what did you play?
Piano. I was a piano player.
Oh, be darned.
And I used to play for dances, for concerts, and I love jazz. And my uncle was the manager of the Hangover Club in San Francisco, which was famous for its Dixieland jazz. And I knew I love Dixie, I love swing, I love modern, I love Dave Brubeck, I love Charlie Parker, all these people. And I tried to play a little bit. I got pretty good. And that was part of my personality, was just kind of a little different than most guys, Wow. So anyway, I become a Dominican, and the first year was awful. Second year was worse. I almost left, but Brother Antoninus, when I had a long, long discussion, and so I figured I guess I better stay. And then in my third year, then it got clear. I knew this is what God wanted me to do. And at a certain point, either in my third year or my fourth year, I kind of knew somehow I'm going to become a professor, I'm going to become a superior, and I'm going to become a preacher. But I don't have a clue how this is going to happen. And so I start out. I'm sent off to France to study at the Sochoir, and I do a license degree there. And I wrote on violence in St. Thomas, and I'm going to write a book on that. I was going to take my thesis and do a book on it, but I just never had the time. And then after that, I got assigned to a Newman Center and closed it down. It was in such chaos, etc. And then I was made a superior right away. I was 32 years old.
Wow.
32 years old. I'm not a Dominican. I hadn't been a Dominican for even 9 years. But 25 guys turned it down to be prior. And there I was. I found that out because I saw the list of all those who said no, 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 no. It was a terrible time in the church.
I was going to ask, like, when did the craziness begin?
Humanae Vitae. That's a little bit before Humanae Vitae. And then when Humanae Vitae came out, it was chaos.
Tell me more.
Well, it was in the Sauchoir that I really met Germain Grisey via letters. And I had read his book on, I forget, it was his first major book, and it's a philosophy book, trying to prove why contraceptive acts are intrinsically evil, putting it in Thomistic language. He didn't put it in that kind of language, but it was more or less the same. And up to that time, I had thought maybe that it wasn't a moral absolute. I felt that. But then when I read that book, he's right, I'm wrong. So when I got to the Sauchoir, all of the professors, except one, and most of the students were convinced with absolute certitude that Paul VI was going to change the teaching of the church on this subject. Two of us, me and a canon lawyer, Father Vermilion, wonderful man. Anyway, I suffered through all that.
So it was only the two of you who knew that he would not, and everyone else
believed that. Everybody thought he was going to change. Oh, it's obvious, mon cher. You're just a mere student. You don't know these things, etc. You idiot. You're a moron. And during that time, what was I going to say? Something hit me. During that particular moments in my life,
You're having letters with Germain Grisey?
Yeah, having letters with, and I was having question after question after question after question after question. He was always saying, I wish I'd have kept the letters, but I didn't, like a dumb cluck, because he sent them via disc. Anyway, when the Humanae Vitae did come out, I was on a plane for Washington, D.C., and so I couldn't, give the old, tell the professors, you were wrong, guys. You were wrong. You were wrong. My thesis director was Father Poirier, who was the first Dominican condemned by John Paul II. Wow. Eventually died a terrible death as the president of the Hemlock Society in France, and died unrepentant. He gave up the priesthood, gave up everything. Wow. So many of those guys left the order, left the church. They were so screwed up because they were so smart. They were so brilliant. But brilliance isn't enough.
What had infected the minds and hearts of these people prior to Humanae Vitae, where there was such a desire for Humanae Vitae to come out? Like, they clearly saw that as representing something much bigger than just contraception. What was already in them to be at that point? Well,
this is my theory. They had learned a kind of a bad Thomism that they thought was bad, but didn't know why. And they didn't understand the theology of chastity very well either. Marital chastity, which is where you have to start. Before you talk about celibate chastity, you've got to understand marital chastity, what that's involved, etc. Nobody was thinking straight on that matter. So when dissenting theologians start writing their views in the 1960s, saying that this should be changed, this is why it should be changed, and this is wrong, and then blah, 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 blah. Well, the intellectuals bit into all this bullshit. Oh, I shouldn't have said that.
It's all right. Keep going.
But and then when the document came out, it was like a slap in the face, and that irritated them so deeply, so profoundly, that many departed, left, said, no, church is wrong, church is wrong, church is wrong. Then they were losing grace. So in my case, I kept, I had no problem. And then I started then when I started to grow in my life of Marian theology and St. Thomas, I was able to continue even though I was doing pastoral work, I was able to continue thinking correctly about a lot of these issues. And the reading the L'Osservatore Romano in the 1970s was great because it was edited by a Dominican father from Ireland. A great guy. He eventually died in the United States, taking care of sisters, but that's neither here nor there. So all of those things were kind of wrapped up in my life. And then I was a prior for 8 years, 2 different communities. And then I discovered my vocation as a parish missionary. And then when I became a parish missionary, then I was tapped by Jordan Allman to go to the Angelicum and teach there. And then when I started teaching there, they wanted me back. And then eventually, after some negotiation with the provincial who first said no, then they got me back teaching. So now I was teaching St. Thomas for the first time. And it was really wonderful. It was great for 11 semesters. I started in 85, and then they needed a professor at the Dominican school in Washington, D.C., and I came in 98, January. Been there ever since.
Can I take us back a little bit to you lived through, as a religious, you lived through Vatican II.
Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot of you guys around that remembered that, and are still able to articulate what that experience was like. As a young guy, I've only heard stories and talked to some people. You've talked about Humanae Vitae as a very pivotal moment.
Big time.
What was it like as a faithful Dominican, as a faithful Catholic, living through Vatican II? What was your mindset at the time? Did you see it as a good thing? Were there concerns? Were people aware of agendas that were going on? Like, what was the whole mindset looking back on it from now?
Okay.
How do you recall yourself living through that and thinking through it?
Okay, the only thing we ever learned was Francis X. Murphy's expose that came in the New Yorker magazine.
Really?
It was called what? I hadn't thought of this in years. Something that, it was like every month there was a summary of what was going on as if you were there, but with a twist by the author who was unknown at the time. It was actually a redemptorist. And you got the impression that there were 2 sides at Vatican II, the liberals and the conservatives.
Yeah.
The liberals were the superstars and the conservatives were putts.
Yes, that's...
and I listened to all that, et cetera. But we knew that there were going to be some changes, but it didn't affect our lives. We were still living our lives, still reading St. Thomas, et cetera, et cetera.
And it wasn't striking you young guys as like a major change in the church?
Right now, no, because we were enclosed. We didn't go out. We didn't watch TV. We didn't listen. Just occasionally articles. But I knew, reading some of the articles that I was reading, that something was going on, principally with the liturgy. And then, but I wasn't a liturgist, and then I could see a few things, but nothing. I really didn't learn much about Vatican II until afterwards, when then I started to go back and discover what chaos took place, and that the enemies, the so-called enemies, were sometimes the good guys. And they always made fun of Cardinal Brown, but he made a lot of sense in retrospect. What he said, but I don't have.
I'm sorry, who was he?
He was our Master General, who became a Cardinal Archbishop, the first Cardinal to become an Archbishop. That you had to, pardon me, when you're made a Cardinal these days, you have to be a bishop. You get the ordination, unless you can talk the Pope out of it, which some have done.
And he participated in Vatican II.
It was a very important person. And the bad guy was the Cardinal in charge of the Holy Office. God, I forgot his name, and I just read him the other day. This is, I'm 87 because I forget names now. I still can't remember it.
All right,
that's
45 do the same.
That's it. So anyway, it was only later that I discovered that quite often the language used was compromising things. I felt a certain compromise, and a lot of fights were going on for a lot of different reasons that I only discovered afterwards, not during, because it became evident to me that the stuff in the New Yorker was fun to read, but it was skewed. You know, it was something. He had an agenda going on. They wanted to remake the church into something new. You know, and when we got the new translations, that was considered to be a really wonderful thing. And then putting the breviary into English, another wonderful thing. Okay, fine, but there was just, it wasn't, if the Pope had established the council to be more legal and not pastoral, I don't think we would have had the chaos. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, quite often, the documents of Vatican II were compromises in language to make things more understandable, without using certain more Thomistic terms. The most of the people that were there were Thomists, all right, but they were reacting against their St. Thomas, and still they would put things in such a fashion that it would be understood by a Thomist, etc. But as I say, at the time, I didn't see the consequences until now. Now I understand a lot. It should have been done a little differently, in my opinion. But that's my opinion.
What was the agenda, do you think, looking back on it? What do you think the agenda was?
More freedom from Rome, more freedom from a bishop, while at the same time emphasizing that they have certain rights, but they shouldn't always exercise them. That would be kind of my thought. And that a top-down faith, that the pastor knows everything, the bishop knows everything, the pope knows everything. No, we're all kind of equal. And that was kind of my feeling when I look back on it.
Yeah. And so you had Humani Vitae, you had Vatican II, of course, and then you have the Novus Ordo, the new Mass. So when you started, you were growing up, so you started saying the Latin Mass. That was the first Mass you were saying.
Correct, in the Dominican Rite.
Dominican Rite, actually. I'm sorry.
And
yes.
then after
which
that,
is quite beautiful.
Yeah, it is. Then after that, the first language of the new liturgy, I think, was in French. That's when I was in France. The first time I said it in English was when I went to Washington D.C. and had to help out in a rest home. And it was my first time I said Mass in English. That I remember.
What was your perspective in saying the new Mass? It was in French first, but what was your perspective after having had the Dominican Rite, which is very similar to the Latin Mass that we experience, right? I mean, when you saw this, did you think, oh, this is nice, or do you think, why did they gut so much of the tradition, or what was your perspective at the time?
Well, I wasn't a fan of Latin Masses, but I must say in retrospect that there was something profound in the Dominican Rite, praying it, saying it. You know, there was something deep going on. And then when I was saying it in French, there was something deep too, because I didn't understand French that well, but I felt that there was something, going on. And then when I started saying it in English, it didn't seem to have the depth for some reason. But I still said it anyway. I tried to say it as piously and as reverently as I possibly could. And then there were other changes that started taking place. There were a lot of little changes that took place over the 70s, from 75 to 80, and then from 80 to 85, tinkerings here and there. And I just sort of went on with it because I was so busy doing other things.
Yeah, yeah.
And not being a liturgist, I didn't care that much.
There's in today's, I guess you've seen, especially recently, the debates, the arguments, the hostility over the liturgical wars.
Oh yeah, it's awful.
It's awful. Help us understand that. Like, what's your perspective on all that going on?
On the one hand, there's priests who believe that the Mass is primarily orientated to God. And then there are other priests who think that the liturgy is primarily orientated to the people and God. Now, if you believe in primacy of God, then you don't fiddle around with it. You take it as is and you try to say it as reverently as you can because you're communicating God and you're representing God. On the other hand, if I'm on the other side, then I'm thinking of, good morning, folks. How are you today? Let's begin the Mass in the name of the Father. The Lord is with you. You see? And this is because it's you. It's about us. It's about community. It's about interrelations, relationships. And then Jesus wants us to be interrelated with one another because Jesus is with us, etc. Where 2 or 3 gathered in my name, there I am in their midst. So Jesus is with you and he's with me, and isn't it wonderful? Ah! You got the point?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I've lived through the point.
So
I've lived through the point.
So there's 2 extremes. I mean, it could be an extreme if you just simply, said Mass quietly to God. No. You do relate to the people that are there, but that's secondary. Primary is the way you talk to God, with God, for the people.
Yeah.
And then you don't go saying, hello there.
Right.
Hi. The body of Christ, Mary, there's a little child there. It loses the sense of the transcendent.
The transcendent, the sacred, the mysterious.
Yeah, mysterium fidei.
And
Yet we say mystery of faith.
mystery of faith. Yeah, and definitely we've all experienced, been growing up in the 80s and 90s. We experienced, I think, probably the heyday of clown masses,
Yeah. And I didn't have to, because I was preaching parish missions. It was totally different.
Right.
So I didn't have your experience.
I wish you had preached at our parishes growing up,
Well,
so, but there was, I would say in the early 2000s, there was a real turn towards the tradition returning.
Correct.
Some
Slowly.
of the younger priests started appreciating the beauty and transcendence, even of the Novus Ordo. They would say it extremely reverently.
Yeah, that's the key.
And then as I studied the liturgy more, I started seeing the nature of it as a sacrifice. I really started seeing that. And as a young altar boy, going to Mass at a mega church with all the silliness, the notion that I was participating in a sacrifice never registered. It just was not registered.
I know.
And when the priest turns and faces everyone, it has a temptation to become more like a show. So that's kind of my perspective.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A show, okay? A show.
I'm sensitive to the liturgical wars, but one of the things that I've tried to do personally and through TAN, while we love and support the Latin Mass, we publish a lot of books on Latin Mass. Mm-hmm. It's very important that I don't publish anything or support any notion that the Novus Ordo is invalid or anything like that, because some of the radicals on the far right take that too far, and that's been a personal mission of mine, is to kind of strike that balance and to to be with Rome as best we can.
Same here.
And the Dominicans, particularly the Eastern Province, those are the ones I know, the ones that you're involved with now. They've been such great, guiding examples of a community that loves tradition, but it is not like my dad always told me. He said, "Son, don't be so heavenly minded. You're no earthly good."
I like that. Yeah. That's good.
So I think that your community's, done that splendidly. So it's amazing that you've lived through all these pivotal times in the church. If you don't mind, so we talked about Vatican II, we talked about Humani Vitae, we talked about the new Mass. Where's the church today? What is going on? There's, when you look at this, given your whole 87-year life perspective and your understanding of church history, there's a lot of conflict in the church right now. There's a lot of unrest about, recent appointments by the Holy Father. I mean, it's a tense and difficult time when we feel that the Holy Father has undone a lot of what Pope Benedict had done. There's a lot of young people that are just distraught and have a lot of anxiety about where the church is going. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to all that? How do you see this?
Well,
I'm not saying anything new to you. You know what I'm talking about.
The first thing we have to keep in mind is the overarching force of divine providence. in what the church is going through now is similar to what mystics go through in the dark nights of the soul. They go through something far worse. This is child's play, what we're going through, compared to what a mystic goes through. That would take us off in another direction. For us, our dark nights that we have to go through, we don't understand the why and the wherefore of divine providence, allowing crazy things to be said, crazy things to be done, bishops that we don't like, priests we don't like, pastors we don't like, all this stuff. Why, Lord? Why do we have to deal with all this? He's not telling us why. He's simply telling us, trust me. Just keep trusting me in this darkness. And just as the mystics eventually get illuminated and go even further in the depths of an intimacy with God, so the rest of us, if we keep holding on and trusting in divine providence, somehow, some way, we will be better, and maybe even the church will be better. But we don't know how, and we don't know when. We just have to accept this in dark faith. It's easy to believe that the host is Jesus Christ. If you have faith, that's Christ. It's not easy to believe that divine providence is ruling the church. It's very difficult in this time, especially when you see the swift changes of thought and context and errors that come floating from priests and bishops' minds, etc. You begin to wonder, where's the divine providence in this? He's still there. He permits, he tolerates, and brings good out of it, but we don't know what it is. But we can cooperate and collaborate with divine providence by affirming divine providence, not affirming the stupidities of priests and bishops and popes, but affirming the fact that God is permitting this for some great good that we don't know about. And we won't know that good until we might see it in this life. We may never see it in this life. We're sort of like that little old lady in Russia who was a Roman Catholic and for 30 years was unable to go to Mass and communion and confession. And every day she went to spiritual communion, she prayed up a storm, and then finally, after 30 years, a Catholic priest showed up in her town and she was able to go to Mass for the first time. All those years, she yearned, she thirsted, she yearned. I've read this, that's why I'm not making it up. And we're in a similar boat. It's a dark night.
A dark night of the church. Wow, mm-hmm. I've never heard that analogy. It's quite beautiful. And
a dark night for us. We're the church. It's a dark night for us. So we hold on. It's like being, I don't know if you've ever been into Disney World, but they have at least in California, Disney World, they had this roller coaster in darkness. And you didn't know it could be pulled this way and pull that way. You didn't go down, you go up like this. It was very scary. The analogy fits perfectly. You don't know what's happening. Ultimately, you know what's happening in front of you, but you don't really know what's happening.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for that. Now, I'm going to, speaking of making hard turns, I'm going to make a hard turn in our conversation and go in a different direction.
I don't care.
But speaking of going through the darkness and not knowing which way you're going, I'm kind of circling back to a lot of the topics that are in your book. Mm-hmm. And before we experience heaven or hell, we experience death. And I wanted to ask you, I've seen kind of two different explanations of sort of like what death is like. Mm-hmm. A more modern explanation is you always hear those anecdotes about seeing the light. It's a peaceful thing. You see the light and you go towards the light. But I've also read like Gregory the Great and other saints that talk about part of the suffering that occurs at death is the disembodiment of the soul. Mm-hmm. And so I sometimes think, Father, it's like if instantly I lost my sight and my hearing and my sense of smell and my sense of taste, my sense of touch, I would freak out completely. It would be a terrifying thing. In fact, there's a form of torture called white torture, where you put somebody in a white room and everything's white and they lose context of their senses and what's going on. And if somebody goes through that long enough, they literally have a depersonalization effect where they almost forget who they are because they've lost the context of the world around them. And so some of the early saints did talk about that's part of the agony of death, is that you have this consciousness of what's going on around you, but you do not have the senses that you've experienced for all of your years on earth. That's scary. That's scary. And then, so do you think in terms of death, before we get to our personal judgment, and we have heaven, hell, or purgatory or whatever, what do you think that moment after death is like? Have you ever heard about that disembodied fear? Does that make sense to you? Or do you think it's something very different?
Well, I would say that people die, one size doesn't fit all. People die differently in a way. Some die at peace. They just sort of like fall asleep and they die in their sleep. And then some people go through agonies. And some people, like there's a famous saint, the doctor of the church, moralist, 18th century, founder of the Redemptorists.
Alphonsus Liguori.
He died a horrible death. He was constantly going to confession every half hour. He was so disembuberated, and yet he's a saint. Okay, so we all die differently. No matter how awful the experience may be, although it isn't always awful. Some people do die in their sleep, and some saints seem to find Jesus appearing to them. Those are rare things. Falling asleep and dying in your sleep, not so much. But no matter how awful or how dreadful or how awful it is, we do know that our Lord will give us the grace to endure it and to make that part of our redemption, part of our penance, part of our getting into heaven, and as a result, lessening the pains of purgatory, maybe even avoiding purgatory, for all we know. But you have to have this trust that it's part of God's plan, that he can, no matter how awful the experience is, that trusting in his grace, he can bring something beautiful out of it for our salvation. But if you don't have trust in him, then it is awful, period.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, like, almost, I don't know if philosophically is the right word, but that experience after you're dead, and now your soul has left the body.
Well, then that's when you're judged.
So you think it goes right into judgment.
It's right into judgment. It's either, and it's instantaneous, you know where you're going. Mm-hmm. And for most of us, it'll probably be purgatory. Very, very few immediately go to heaven, but some do. And probably a lot go to damnation.
That's something that I've also noticed, Father. You write extensively in your book. A number of different times there's opportunities for you to mention that, we essentially choose hell. Like we make these decisions over a long period of time. And but I struggle, and I think a lot of people do. On the one hand, Jesus Christ talks about hell all the time. He gives us these warnings about the road to heaven is narrow, There's so many parables, there's so many examples where it sounds like hell is just knocking at everybody's door. And then there's so much stuff about his incredible mercy where he seems to forgive sinners so quickly and easily. And I maybe it's just too human of a question, but I constantly ask myself, is it easy to go to hell or is it hard to go to hell? And maybe those are just the wrong words, but that's my question that I constantly have.
Well, if you look at all the hell fire and hell teachings of Christ, it presumes one important theological truth, That is, you will go to damnation if you choose not to depend upon the help of the Lord. But if you're choosing to depend upon the help of the Lord, it ain't going to happen. It's all those, all that damnation things is if you think you can get yourself into heaven, you are on your own, you can get yourself into. The reason why the road to heaven is narrow is because you think you can do it on your own. But if you say you can get into heaven and it's a wide road, if you're holding on the hands of Mary and Jesus, then it's a wide road.
Beautiful.
Now, he doesn't say that, but that's kind of understood in the theological tradition.
Yeah.
You hold on to Jesus and Mary and Joseph, and then all of a sudden it's wide. You just do it on your own, very, very limited, and you probably lose your way.
Since we're talking about hell, can I ask you something about mortal sin? Something I've thought a lot about.
Yeah, fine.
So my understanding is that mortal sin, there's three aspects to mortal sin. One is a grave matter, is the issues of grave matter. And then secondly, you have full knowledge. And third, you have consent. Now, the way I've always thought about mortal sin, I studied Aristotle a lot, wrote a book on Aristotle's ethics.
Oh, good for you.
And so I like the way he talks about the four moral characters of the virtuous, the continent, the incontinent, and the vicious. And I see how he talks about the vicious are people who have worked through the stages of incontinence and slowly given themselves over to vice, and they lose remorse. And the vicious, they do something bad, they don't even think about it, they don't question it. Their reason and their passions are aligned towards the evil. Mm-hmm. So I kind of have that sense. And also, Father, as a civil lawyer and somebody who sat through federal court for 2 years as a law clerk, when I think of capital punishment, and which is usually required to have premeditated murder, right? So I think of when somebody has commits premeditated murder, they planned it. It was usually over time. They thought very clearly. There was no, their culpability wasn't really diminished in any way. Mm-hmm. There was no duress. Second degree murder or manslaughter can be like the heat of passion. The famous example is a guy walks in and finds his wife having an affair and he kills the guy. That's the famous example everybody talks about. Well, your passions were completely, out of whack at that moment. You're not going to get the death penalty for that because it wasn't premeditated, right? So I think of the death penalty sort of as an analogy, an earthly analogy to hell. And then I think of mortal sin as sort of an analogy to premeditated murder. Very clear on the sin that you're going to commit, and it's grave. It's a grave sin. You have clear intent, and you know what you're doing, and you know the consequences of this, and you still commit the mortal sin. Because I think the church teaches, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you commit mortal sin, the punishment is hell unless you have forgiveness in some form.
If you die first.
Correct. That's what I mean. Like if you die without having of some kind of forgiveness. Now, so with that mortal sin, with those three conditions, I'm sorry for going on about it, but I hear people, priests from the pulpit, especially the more traditional leaning, I think, Father, that they throw the word mortal sin around almost equivalent with grave matter. So, for example, they'll say, well, abortion's a mortal sin. And I look at that and say, well, you don't know that. Abortion's an activity, which is grave matter. There's plenty of 13-year-old girls that have been driven into abortion completely against their free will, So I'm not going to call that a mortal sin. So it's kind of something that bothers me, is that I think we throw around the word mortal sin a lot. So help me with this. I mean, you've kind of heard my spiel, but help me with this. What is mortal sin? What's really required? And if I'm right, it seems like it's not terribly frequent, at least with regular, well-intentioned people. You don't just slip into mortal sin even more than you slip into capital to premeditated murder. You don't slip into that. You slip into manslaughter perhaps because you had a really bad situation, but you don't just slip into mortal sin. So help me understand if I have this right. Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.
Well, it's more complicated. First of all, there are degrees of mortal sin. That's complicated, right over there. You know, a person who directly plans for 3 weeks or 3 years is different from the person maybe who plans for a half an hour or an hour. Okay, so you've got to keep in mind that there are different degrees, and then we have to keep in mind there's a distinction between formal mortal sin and material mortal sin that can spill over to formal, but you don't always know when a person's doing that. You know, when I'm hearing confessions and somebody confesses something that's they think is a mortal sin, it may very well be the case that they made a mistake here in judgment, that it wasn't a mortal sin at all, though they thought it was. So there can be a lot of confusion here. Okay, now, so what is a mortal sin? Okay, it's a moral act, a human act, first of all, and that's broad. Some people's human acts are more intense. Some people's acts are just barely, like a 7-year-old. You know, a 7-year-old human act is different from a 30-year-old. Even from a human act from a very virtuous person is different from a human act from somebody that's not so very virtuous, you know, kind of slobbery, you know. And so so it's a human act looked at with degrees, okay, that goes against right reason, okay. What's reason? Now, what determines what's right reason? Now we come into your field of philosophy. Well, that right reason implies that there are certain actions that fulfill a person humanly and certain actions that devalue himself personally. Okay? Now, as you put it, there has to be knowledge, but that word knowledge has degrees as well. The knowledge of a 7-year-old is not the knowledge of a 70-year-old. And so there might very well be mortal sin in the 7-year-old, and there might not be a sin in the 70-year-old if he's a little going boop-boo, boop-boo, you know, upstairs, you see. So it's, on the subjective level, it's kind of complex compared to a simple definition which you said is true. You know, but it's analogous. It's got degrees in modifications here and there. Okay, so it's possible for somebody then to commit something with all of the definitions that you've given, but for some mysterious reason, they're not all there, and only God knows that. Okay. Now, that's helpful if you're a confessor. But now, if you're speaking about objectively what's a mortal sin, grave matter, but even light matter with evil intent is not included in that definition.
Right.
So that's another little thing, you know. Likewise, I might have do a very good deed, but I have an evil intention. Yeah. Well, that's not, you know, it's not grave matter, but the intention is kind of thrown the thing off. Okay. And then, of course, I might do all of that. I guess we're getting back to subjectivity. I might do all of that because I may have a screw loose in my brain. So I'm not fully there. And how far and how close is that to something becoming gravely sinful? It's God's God. Let God worry about that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's clear what a mortal sin is in theory, but it may not always be so clear in reality, given the human person. That there are some things that are always intrinsically evil,
Yes.
exist, but they're not many. Most of the commandments are positive. If you look carefully, there are very few negative commandments, maybe 7 or 10 or 8, something like that. But there's a lot more things that are positive laws that admit of exception. And there's these few: murder, abortion, contraception, impure thoughts and desires, masturbation, a lot of the sexual, but not all the sexual, because sometimes some people can all of a sudden have an experience of masturbation and they're not masturbating because they're not fully aware of what they're doing for a lot of things. And so it's very, very, it's not easy going. Now, so then to say mortal sin, if you're going to preach on mortal sin as a priest, you have to kind of make sure that you're saying that there's a distinction between formal and material. And the material mortal sin is to be avoided, don't get me wrong, because sometimes material mortal sin can turn into formal mortal sin, as we know from experience. When you know something, you don't know something, you're ignorant about it, and then you find out that what you did was wrong, and then you still go around doing it, well, all of a sudden you've slipped into something formal. And again, depends on the depth of that. Again, depends upon your development intellectually and volitionally. Does this help?
Yes, it does. And I guess another way of asking my question is, it seems like the virtuous state, right? If somebody who's extremely holy, that's not an act, right? That's
consequence.
That's a consequence.
Many
acts. It becomes that disposition of their soul that's been formed by the habit.
But they can still fall into grave sin.
Absolutely. But you're not going to have a Mother Teresa who just up and all of a sudden decides to commit a mortal sin. Like, practically speaking, she ain't going to do that. It's going to be a little venial, and slowly over time works her way out of that great level of grace that she lives in.
That's possible, yeah.
So
we're not impeccable. But although there is the grace of impeccability, but it's given to very few.
Well, I don't have it.
It's given to the Blessed Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, and then also when you're in the higher, there are different states of if you follow the Carmelite tradition, there's 7 states or 8 states of holiness. There's the beginner. The Thomistic is easier: beginner, advanced, perfect. So if you're towards the perfect, chances are you may get the gift of impeccability. From grave sin, you're rarely given the impeccability of venial sin. But anyway.
Well, so just like the holiness is, you're living in a different moral character. You're living in a state of grace, and
you're living more consciously with God and Christ.
Right, and that's a state of being that you're in.
That is
it's
correct.
Not an activity
that you've worked at.
Right. I would think it's the same thing.
The activities have brought about that effect.
Correct. No doubt, I get that.
Okay.
So it's easy for me to understand that in the terms of the state of grace. I tend to think that mortal sin is the opposite, where you've gotten into a state of lack of grace, right? A state of sin. And so you've become that vicious character that Aristotle talks about.
But do you still have grave sins of weakness? You can still have grave sins of weakness.
Absolutely, but a grave sin of weakness, again, using Aristotle's language, that's kind of like the incontinent character who, it's almost like his knees buckle under pressure.
Yeah.
This is the guy who fails, and he runs off and goes to you to confession.
Correct.
Because he feels bad as hell about what he did.
As he should. But when he doesn't feel bad as hell, then we got a problem.
We got a big problem. So thank you. This is exactly what I'm saying. So this is kind of a trick question, but it seems to me, and again, maybe I'm putting it into imperfect language, but it would seem to me that a priest actually doesn't hear mortal sin, in the phrase, formal mortal sin, all that frequently in confession, because those guys have stopped going to confession.
Correct. It's probably true. Yeah,
Okay.
probably true. That's today, not necessarily yesterday.
Right. So I think that the problem isn't the people. I mean, I think people go and confess grave matter all the time.
Oh yeah,
That's
they do.
clearly the case.
Yeah.
But when they have truly fallen completely out of the state of grace, confession's probably not on their mind. So that's been a...
And until they're to get to a rest home. I remember one time when I was a young priest in St. Dominic's in San Francisco, I went to a rest home, and I went up to this lady and I said, would you like to go to confession and communion? And she says, oh, I haven't been to confession since I was a younger person. And I said, well, how old were you was your last confession? I think I was 18. How old are you now? I'm 91.
Amazing.
And then when you give parish mission, sometimes you get the 40 or the 50-year-olds, 50 years since my last confession, 40 since my last confession. Because we're not, unlike angels, we're not fully stuck into a decision. We have a certain waffability about us. So we can turn even to the good, no matter how much evil we've done. Likewise, we can turn to the evil, no matter how good we are. And that's why we have to keep begging for grace of perseverance.
Yeah. Now, I found myself saying in some of my public addresses and talks I've given, and I don't know if it's true. It's just, I say things, but now I'm talking to a real expert. So,
Semi.
So it has seemed to me, Father, that people would think that lust is kind of the sin of our age. And I'm using very loose terms. These are not great theological terms, but each age maybe has like a certain characteristic. And lust is the one that's kind of easy to pin the tail on that donkey
Since the 1920s.
1920s, wow, yeah.
That's when it started.
And I want to hear more about that. But it seems, first I want to go to, it seems to me that it's sloth. It seems to me... Achadia, and this is amazing chapter in your book on this. So I kind of wanted to go into that. And as you explain it, just kind of help me. Am I right in basically thinking that this is the sin that's really plaguing our world with all the commercialism and the productivity, all the things that we have in this life? I have likened it, Father, to the Trojan horse that comes in the gates, and the Greek soldiers are hiding in the belly of the horse. Busyness and productivity and effectiveness, running all this stuff is like that Trojan horse, and sitting inside that horse of busyness is the sin of achadia. And so am I right about that?
Well, that can be, what's the word? That can be camouflaging achadia. Busyness running, because you're not being busy for the right reasons.
Right, absolutely.
You're trying to escape from certain ultimates, etc. And so you develop a certain despising dislike for spiritual things, and that is kind of the consequence of the previous vices. I don't think anybody starts out with achadia. I think that's the very nail in the coffin.
Well, that's a great point, because it is towards the end of the book. And so, it's all those other things kind of lead to it.
Kind of lead to it, yes. Not necessarily, but can and do.
So do you translate it as sloth?
You can that's the traditional translation. It's called sloth. Achadia seems to be the preferred one among theologians, because it is a certain sadness about spiritual things, a certain disgust about spiritual things. Now, as we know, human beings are flexible. You can be a horrible person and still, at the last moment, change your mind. And even though you've got a corrupt heart, and you can get absolution, and I've done it many times, and I give sacrament to people that have been away for 30, 40, lived horrible lives, and that they can repent. God can give that grace. It's not natural. It's grace that does this sort of thing.
It seems to me that this is a sin that's almost like the secret sin of people, because it sneaks up on them, and if they have it, it's almost like they don't even know they have it.
That's also true. Yes. Yes.
Because if it's lust, you kind of know it's lust.
Yes,
if it's gluttony, you kind of know. If it's anger and you blow up and scream
it's
at the
clear.
kids,
It's clear. It's clear. But this is not clear. This is a subtle one. You're right.
You probably don't hear it confessed very often.
Nope. Once in a great while. Once in a great while. But it usually is once we recognize that somebody has to wake you up to the fact that you are in this state.
Right, because you're asleep, basically.
You're asleep towards eternal things, and sometimes a parish mission does that for some people. All of a sudden, it wakes them up. Wait a minute! I've been on the wrong track, and here's why, etc.
Yeah, it's an amazing, and your description of it's incredible. Going back, I want to talk about pride and vainglory. We'll come back to lust, and I want to hear about the 1920s, but. Not that I want to go to confession here on the air, but
don't.
I'm not.
This is not the place.
I'm not. I promised my wife I'm not going to go to confession on the air. But it's when you think of pride,
right?
And that's somebody who has a totally inflated sense of self, and when I read like a definition of pride, it's something that doesn't necessarily jump off at me and says, oh, that's my sin. I mean, I know that and we'll talk about this, but like the root of sin and pride's present in all the other sins. My point is this though, Father, when I read your chapter on vainglory, that had a very different, it resonated with me very differently than the word pride.
Correct.
And
it's the property of pride.
Yes, and I wanted you to talk about that because I even said the word to myself very slowly, vain glory, like I'm glorying in a vain thing, wanting recognition, wanting reputation. It's very different than just thinking more of myself. In fact, a lot of people who are seeking vainglory are very insecure, have low opinions of themselves.
That's true. That's true.
And so I'm just saying that it's drawing that distinction between pride and vainglory, it really helped me reflect on vainglory as something to be confessed a whole lot more often, because just something about how you described that felt much more personal to me than just regular old pride.
Well, we have to keep in mind that there's vainglory and there is a virtuous desire for glory. A lot of people conflict the two. Sometimes if you want some recognition that's always wrong. No. Children need affirmation. Young adults need affirmation. We all need, at certain points in our lives, affirmation about our goodness. That's what husband and wife are doing, really. And not every day, mind you, but from time to time, I really appreciate you. I really love you. I think well of you. You mean something to me. I may not use those words, but my attitude indicates all of that. You see, and that's just the way we are. That's not sinful. That's reasonable. It's when you start yearning for adulation and constantly orientating your life, looking to what. Like one time, an entertainer I knew was playing the accordion in a concert, and so people were clapping and yelling, and he did this, and then he finally did this
with his hand, stopping with one hand and bringing it with the other hand.
I want more. I want more.
Yeah.
And so that can happen with but there is, as I say, there's that reasonable side. It's reasonable, but it's not talked about too often.
Yeah. So vainglory. Everyone hears pride and says that's the root of all sin, but you have a different explanation of the queen and what was the I'm sorry.
Well, the root would be, following St. Thomas, would be avarice.
Because I think 99% of well-formed Catholics would say that pride's the root of all sin.
It depends on your definition of what you're talking about.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Pride is called, in St. Thomas, called the queen. She governs the vices, because if I have a high opinion of myself, of my talents, of my glory, of my importance, of my this, of my this, of my this, well, then I necessarily get angry when I don't get it. I necessarily am going to demand more material things. I necessarily demand more from you. I necessarily demand more appreciation of my sexual prowess. I demand better foods. You see how pride will interfere?
Yes.
So that would be the attitude of the pride. But now, when it comes to looking at the teleology, the end of avarice being the root, well, since we're bodily creatures, we necessarily want material things. A lot, excessively, too much. And that, in turn, also leads to these other sins as well. So both avarice and pride can lead to all these other capital vices. That's why we call one the root and why we call the pride the queen.
Oh, it's a better distinction. I really.
Is it wrong to say that pride is the root of all? No. You just explain it what you mean. This is Thomistic terminology. That's all.
No, yeah, I love it. Now, daughters. You want to talk about daughters of vices? Help us, because it's a fascinating topic. There's a whole lot of them, but just give us an overview of that.
Well, pride doesn't have any daughters. Pride just, Thomas just simply says it has consequences with God, and then it has consequences with oneself, or inflating oneself, etc. It's the other vices that produce other vices, and there are 44 of them.
Wow.
And I can't remember them all.
All right.
I have in my briefcase somewhere.
But
a copy.
Pride doesn't have the vices, but vainglory. Pride doesn't have the daughters, but vainglory.
Vainglory does, correct. And they all have them, and they all come down to disordered reactions to either people or to things. And that would be the more easy way of understanding these daughters. But then going through one by one, I don't have a perfect memory in my mind. I have a wonderful outline in my briefcase of like this, a piece of paper like this, with in the middle is pride, and then the
branches,
the branches around, and then the daughters, and some of them are 8. Some of them are 6, depends on what they are. It comes down to bad language, insulting people, or talking about people behind their back, or loving the things of this world to the exclusion of the next world. That's one of the vices. That's one of the daughters of lust. See.
Well, you speaking of lust now, just a minute. So that you said, I actually only flagged one passage to read.
Oh, right, okay.
And it's just on, remember exactly. It was talking about things in the wake of lust. And you said when lust takes over a person's life, it can become a kind of anti-form or inner force working against all the virtues. Vainglory comes in the wake of lust in the form of desire for a well-paying career, which works against the more mundane yet important responsibility of raising a family. Then there's the unreasonable desire to be more important than friends and neighbors. When this does not happen because of a lack of funds, then envy comes crashing into the soul. Like you do such a good job at explaining how these vices follow one after another, and in the wake of lust, all these other things come.
Bedfellows. That's another word I like to.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And these things are not isolated; they're connected.
Yes, and I wish I had my piece of paper that had all the vices listed, but it's there in my.
That's all right. That's all right. So boasting versus vainglory. This was just another distinction that I found kind of fascinating.
Right. It's a proper. It flows. It flows. If I think, if I'm doing all I can to make sure you know that I am a master of sacred theology, you jerks out there, and I'm going to show off myself, and I'm going to produce all in front of my door. I'm going to list all my publications. I'm going to list all my awards, so you fellas know how important I am. See, I'm boasting with material, not verbally, but I can do that verbally too.
Yeah.
How do you know what you're talking about? I'm the one that has a doctorate in theology. You're just simply a novice here. Although, in fact, God may give the novice more grace than he's given me. That's because God is God.
I just love the distinction. Like boasting is based on your view of yourself, and vainglory is your desire for recognition. It's just the clarity of thought here is just.
That's not me. That's Thomas.
It's just masterful, though. All right. To counteract we could talk about all the vices, but one of the first virtues that you jump into to start talking about is the virtue of penance. Now, I guess I missed this, but I never thought of penance as a virtue.
I know. That's because most Thomists, most people that study Thomas, they think of all the virtues and the vices are found in the Secunda Secundae. But this particular virtue is found in the Tertia Pars, because Thomas wants to relate this virtue to the sacrament of penance, which is now called by another name in this country. We call it reconciliation, which is true. I'm not saying it's false. And so as a result, the idea of penance being a virtue didn't make sense to a lot of people. But when you think about it, if you come to confession and say, I am sorry for my sins and I hope to do better in the future, how do you hope to do better in the future? You remain in the state of grace by living a penitential life. Not like a monk or a nun or a priest, but following the same procedures. What are the procedures? Well, prayer, works of mercy. If you're a mom and a dad, you're doing works of mercy all the time with your kids.
Clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, that's for sure.
And then you're also doing
All the
penance.
time.
You're also doing penance when you cut back on the booze and the wines and the food and, eat simply and all that stuff. And sometimes, giving up food you like. Not just one, but all three are the principal means of penance. See? And so you can see how if you stick to those three, well, you're going to probably avoid a lot more sins. It's primarily prayer, not fasting, primarily, somewhat helpful. Certainly next to primary, as a consequence, works of mercy. The works of mercy should flow from one's prayer life. So looked at in that perspective, it is a kind of a virtue, a cluster of other virtues,
Wow.
but put under the rubric of penance.
Yeah.
Because it's not fun to pray all the time. It's not fun. It's not delightful to put aside a banana split pie. It's not fun to give up a single malt Scotch every day. It's not fun to wrap your children or go to the bathroom and they're sick and they're crapping all over the place and you got all those.
I live in a sewage treatment center.
Yes, exactly. But that's a work of mercy.
Boy, I hope so.
It is.
That's just, my saintly wife, I feel perfectly fine, but I'm losing my voice. But everybody in North Carolina, I think, has had some kind of cold in the last month,
Of course.
And our 4-month-old father, she's just had the congestion, and a little baby doesn't know how to blow their nose and cough it up, so this baby has to basically sleep sitting up for the last almost 2 weeks. And so my wife is basically sleeping in a chair or propped up in the bed, and the baby wakes up every 5-10 minutes, my wife has not had a good night's sleep in weeks.
Not a good idea.
And so, takes naps and stuff when we can, but there's only so much. She's still nursing. There's not much I can do. So my point is that this is a mother, and there's a lot of mothers out there probably listening to this. But the talk about the corporal works of mercy, doing that. You're sacrificing your sleep continually for your children. Right. And I think that they just don't get enough credit for that.
Penance.
It's penance.
There it is.
There it is. Yeah, that's now help me with the theology on let's say somebody commits some pretty nasty sins. They go to confession, they mean it. The priest gives them 3 Hail Marys. They walk out of the box, they kneel down, they say 3 Hail Marys, and they walk out. come on, how does that pay for what they just did?
Well,
You understand my question.
normally the penance, see, this is a lack of knowledge on the part of many priests, I think, maybe in teaching this, that the penance you receive in the sacrament, as good and holy as it is, it's only a portion. It's a beginning that should continue, you know?
And so is that where you have, I was told once years ago, sin is like taking an axe and putting it into the tree or into the table, let's say. Confession and penance is taking the axe out. Reparation is filling the hole in.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you fill the hole in it with penance.
Penance. Oh, okay. So not just the 3 Hail Marys.
No. That's the 3 Hail Marys are the sign that you're obeying, or you're obeying the church by doing something. It's something. It's a prayer, but it's not the entirety.
So then what am I, okay, after he gives me 3 Hail Marys, what then am I supposed to go do other than, live a holy life? But I mean, how do I know if I've done the penance sufficiently?
Well, you have done the penance, the canonical penance. Now you have to continue with the spirit of the canonical penance, the spirit, the virtue of penance. In other words, the canonical thing is one, the virtue is the other. And that's what has to be taught over and over again. That's the purpose of Lent, to keep people doing penance all year.
Yes.
And explaining all this for the whole year. But not many parishes do this.
Now, you cited a document in the church where it says that every Friday throughout the whole year is supposed to be still a penitential day.
Correct.
And we should abstain from meat or something else.
Something else.
And I think very few people know that.
That is correct, because priests don't talk about it.
Because we just think Fridays during Lent we don't eat meat.
That is correct.
So do you recommend we not eat meat on Fridays year round? I mean, that was the traditional way, right? I mean, is that what people should basically just do?
Well, it depends on circumstances too, whether you can do a thing like that. And you can't become scrupulous about it, and it's a positive admonition, not a negative one. It's not saying that it's evil. See, in the old days, in my day, it was evil to eat meat on Friday unless the bishop dispensed you or the special circumstances dispensed you. I remember when I was a teenager, I would eat meat on Friday by going to the consular general house in San Francisco in the Philippines, because he had the dispensation of the cardinal archbishop that he could serve meat on Friday because he was a diplomat. So that didn't mean whoever it was. Wow. So I'd go and have salami sandwiches and beer and scotch and a few other things in my corrupt life.
See, I think God appreciates the ingenuity. I think he likes your ingenuity. I do.
Well, that's the way it was. But see, today that isn't the case. Today there's no sin attached to that sort of thing. It's a positive thing.
Oh, okay.
Nevertheless, people should be a little more creative. Instead of having spaghetti and meatballs on Friday, have olio and olio.
Right. Right.
Or have bagna calda, which is an old from Bergamo. You have it. I don't explain it, but anyway, there's just other ways of having a good meal without necessarily having meat.
Right.
It requires a lot of.
Now, something that shocked me, I think this was close to a shock. My eyes opened up. As a dad of 8 boys, 8 girls, I have adult children who have begun their adult life and have suffered and have been through challenges. I've had little children get injured and watching them suffer. I've also seen my children sin. I've seen my young adults sin, and realized that different times they've fallen into sin.
Yeah.
Father, it's when you see your child suffering from sin or suffering in any way, it hurts worse than your own reflection on your own sin. There's which is maybe not good, but that's been my experience. So I read that we are able to some extent to do penance for others. And so the idea that I could, let's say I know that one of my children really is struggling with a certain sin, dishonesty, or it's lust, or it's anger because they just blow up and beat, strike out their siblings or whatever it may be. As a father, I can take on a penance for that child, and there's some kind of grace that flows to them. Help me understand that better, because it's funny that I'm hesitant to do penance for myself because it feels like drudgery, which is not good. But I almost jump at the chance to do penance for my children. If I can ease their spiritual load, if I could somehow take on a cross for them, if I could do penance for them so they have more grace flow to them, that's so easy and for me to do, or at least to throw myself into it, even more so than for myself. Help me with.
Sounds like you should have been a Carmelite nun.
Well, I don't know what that means.
If you want to be a Carmelite nun, you want to do penance for the church. And you want to suffer for the souls of others. No, having said all that, I meant that in jest and in seriousness at the same time.
Sure.
The principal means of helping people grow out of their sins, yes, is to sacrifice something for them. The first sacrifice, of course, is prayer. The second sacrifice is fasting. And the third sacrifice might be able to, correct them and all the rest of it. But we can merit for others based upon the mercy of God. We can merit for ourselves injustice because God has made it such that we can merit grace. When I go to Mass and Communion, and I want to grow in something, or I need a favor, I can merit something that's necessary for my salvation. If I offer Mass for a friend of mine, well, it's certainly going to be helpful, but it's not going to be injustice, if you follow me. There's a word we use that's just escaped me now. We call that, I forgot the theology of merit. I used to teach this. There's merit strictly taken and merit broadly taken. And we can merit broadly for others through our prayers and our sufferings. We can't merit strictly. Only God can do that. That's why you can, for example, I can be sacrificing for my father that he may become a Catholic for 10 years and see nothing, 20 years and see nothing, 30 years and see nothing, 40 years and see something, and then maybe he will get the grace. That's called, darn it.
It's all right.
Congruous merit.
Oh, there you go.
As distinct from the other merit. Merit strictly taken.
Congruous.
Congruous merit. It's congruous. That is to say, so much depends upon God and the cooperation of others. So, having said all of that, all of us priests are called to offer up prayers for others. That's part of being a priest, is to offer prayers. You can have masses said for people who need prayers.
Yes.
And need help. You can give up a drink of Scotch for somebody you love. Yeah. That's meritorious, broadly taken.
Yeah.
And it might very well bring them a grace.
I think spouses could do this a whole lot better.
Yes.
It's, my wife's amazing, but she sins like anybody. But, I love her so much, I don't want her to suffer for her sins. I don't want her to do it. I'd rather suffer for her.
Good.
You know what I mean? And it's one of those kinds of things where I think that spouses could be a whole lot more intentional about taking on penances for the other person. And
priests can be the same thing, but sometimes we're just as weak as you are.
Yeah.
We don't do enough. In all parishes, the priest is obliged to celebrate a Mass for the parish every single week throughout the entire year. And because the Mass has a certain efficacy all of its own. It's an act of penance in the broad sense of the word.
Sure. You have a notion of soft living, which I love that phrase. I had not really heard that, but it makes perfect sense, right? And so related to this whole idea of penance, we stink at doing penance. We look for every way to avoid penance because this world has soft living. Do you remember talking about that? Tell us a little bit about soft living.
That was a translation that I saw years ago. Anyway, what it comes down to is the failure to accept the fact that some things are only worth achieving by doing a little more difficult things.
Yeah.
Because of original sin, we tend to be more concupiscent than more aggressive. And that is because we don't have a clear idea of the end or the goal that we're trying to achieve. That's speaking abstractly, I know. But if I have a clear idea of where I'm going and how what I want, I will have a clear goal of how I'm going to get there, and I'm going to stick to it. If I want to become a concert pianist, I'm going to practice 7 hours a day because I want to really be a concert pianist. I have a passion for that. So just like the pianist or the artist has that desire for beauty in producing things, so the Christian should have a similar kind of a desire for wanting to grow in personal holiness, and to want his children to grow in personal holiness, or to want his class to grow in holiness, or in the case of the priest, for his parish to grow in holiness. See, if I don't have that desire, then it's ho-hum, oh, whatever.
Right.
That's the theme, whatever, soft-living.
I would think that does God take into consideration in our judgment that, we live in an extraordinarily soft-living world, right? We have extraordinary comforts. We have pleasure at demand, more than any culture throughout
in this culture, yeah.
Yeah, throughout all of history of man. Like, I live 1,000 times better than the kings of medieval England.
Agreed.
He didn't have a microwave. I got a microwave.
Right.
So, those luxuries. Like, it's not my fault I was born into a luxurious
They're not
state.
evils.
Right. Okay.
They're goods. They're a plenitude of goods. You can become overly attached to those goods, but so could the king of England if he had them too. It's the same. It's just God somehow has given you and me a whole host of material goods that he didn't give others.
Right.
Why? Don't know. But does that mean that we can't become holy using them wisely and reasonably? Of course we can.
Yeah.
It's a matter of what we speak in spirituality of attachment, detachment. Attachment reasonably, willingness to let go reasonably. But sometimes you can't let go of certain attachments. You can't. You got to support your family. You got to have an income.
Yeah.
You got to have money. You got to have cash. That doesn't mean that you're overly attached. You see, there's a big difference between reasonable attachment and overly attachment. And that's where detachment comes in.
Since you just brought up money, married life, something that a lot of married people deal with, I think even more in today's world than in previous times, is, in most cultures throughout the history of man, most people that bought something, they bought something only because they had money to buy it. Now everything's debt. And so it's really a phenomenon that wasn't as prominent for the average person. So now everyone starts their early adult life with $100,000 of student loans, and then they have a car payment of $500 a month, and then they get a $2,000 mortgage payment that they have to pay for 30 years. It's just insane, And so, given those, what I would call historically, extraordinary circumstances of debt, our entire economy is structured around people being in debt. Does that reduce the need of the typical family in the tithing obligations? Because you're looking at, okay, how much do I give to a church? The church has always said 10%, but I look at that and say, well, hang on a second. Like, everyone's paying way more than that in interest just on all of their loans that they have, they have to have just to function in the world. So obviously we still have to be generous, but do you think that kind of situation with the typical debt structure has an influence on the generosity that we have to give in tithing?
Well, we're not obliged to tithe. That's the first thing. That's a matter of counsel, not of commandment. And then we are obliged to support the church according to what's reasonable for our family, because we have to love ourselves first. And if you have to feed a family and you've got to live in a modern world, there's certain things you certainly need. And so you can't just simply sacrifice essentials in order to help a church work. You have to learn to distinguish what is essential and what is accidental, what can be given away, what cannot be given away, and it may be meager.
Yeah, I think just a practical example is somebody wants to give more to the church, but they also see the value of paying off their mortgage a whole lot quicker.
Of course.
And so they give a little less to the church than they could give, and they throw more at the mortgage company, so they stop paying the stupid interest. And when that's done, then they're going to have an influx of cash because they don't have a mortgage anymore, and then they can be more generous.
Of course.
Now,
common sense.
Right. And so if they reach that point, they have the influx of cash, they're debt free, and all of a sudden they go buy a boat instead of helping out the church. Now they're getting into more a greedy lifestyle, and so they have to take those things.
Maybe.
Right.
Not necessarily. Maybe that boat's necessary, and we don't know why.
Right. Yeah. It's so easy.
Assuming the worst. Yeah.
Right. It's just easy to slip into.
Yes.
You know, as soon as how many people are ever as generous as they hope to be later?
That's true.
It kind of slips away.
Granted, but it's still a reasonable thing to do.
Right. And so, with my children, my adult children, practically, I really encourage them to try to reduce the amount of debt because it's just crippling.
Of course.
But I also want them giving something to the church from day one, right? To form that habit. Form that habit.
That's true.
Tan Books is here to help you become a saint. That's why we do everything we do. We publish thousands of titles, literally, that are specifically written to help you get to heaven. Everything from the lives of the saints to the writings of the saints, the greatest doctors of the church, the great spiritual masters, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Francis de Sales, and so on. So please come to tanbooks.com and find the book that God wants you to have right now so that you can get to heaven and be a saint for eternity. I think the last vice I'm going to ask you about, and the last virtue I'm going to ask you about, is that of anger. And you wrote about that beautifully. And it's really the gentleness that I want to talk about as kind of that virtue that remedies anger. And you mentioned that gentleness is not just a virtue. There's something special about gentleness because it's a virtue and it's a gift of the Holy Spirit. There's more to it than just gentleness overcomes anger. There's something quite remarkable and unique about gentleness because it is that gift of the Holy Spirit, or a fruit of the Holy Spirit.
Fruit, yeah.
So can you talk to us about the relationship of anger and gentleness? I, being somebody who struggles with anger, and I read about gentleness and how it's very freeing. It's very soothing.
True.
So I want to hear you talk about gentleness.
Okay, well, let's start with anger. First, as a passion, it's good or it's bad. It's the good side is it defends and protects people. It also motivates persons to do the right thing sometimes. And there's a lot of pluses that come from holy anger. Christ himself whipped people out of the temple. Okay, boom, boom. Then there's the vice of anger that comes about because you don't get what you want, because you're envious, because of all the other vices that we've been talking about. You feel frustrated, you feel put upon, you feel this, you feel that, and so you strike out. You want to take revenge. Now, as I live the life of charity, which is the love of God and the love of neighbor. Loving the neighbor means what? Well, developing the little virtue of friendliness. Good morning, how are you? Pleasantness. Okay. Helping my neighbor when he or she needs it. Doing what I can to uphold the truth to my neighbor when we get into arguments and to try to understand what's happening. All right. Now, insofar as I'm trying to do that, I'm not yelling at him or her. I'm trying to, the mode that I'm doing that is my concern for his or her welfare, like you try to do with your children, with your wife, with your colleagues, etc. There's gentleness. You're still stating the truth. You're still, and you're willing to argue things. You're willing to correct things when they have to be corrected, but it's done in a mode of a willingness not to take everything so personal, like it's against you. You're not taking revenge. You're trying to do what's reasonable, even though you might even have a little anger going on with it. See, anger and gentleness may very well be united. It might be reasonable anger, as distinct from screaming and yelling and harping, etc. And then on the other hand, holding the truth, saying things quietly and gently. Inside, you're steaming, but outside, you're showing respect for that person, even though they're doing what's wrong or what's happening falsely, etc. Is that making sense?
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Now, how is it a gift of the Spirit?
I think what Thomas means is it's a...
No, I'm sorry, a fruit. I keep saying gift.
Yeah,
I mean a fruit.
What he means is that as you're living the spiritual life, as I've described it, because to be able to do that, you have to have grace. And to be able to have grace, you have what are called infused virtues. You may very well also be under one of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. In that instance, you see, you're able to be this gentle from a higher spirit. You're being gentle because the Holy Spirit is giving you this grace to do that. Does that make sense now?
Yeah.
You have it in principle, but it may be in actuality, it may be coming from one of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit.
Now,
which would take me a long time to explain.
Yeah, well, you've done great. Now, you're an expert in virtues and vices. You've been a priest for how many years?
It'll be 60 in 2 years.
Do you ever hear any? Is everything in confession you hear same old, same old? I mean,
No.
Is it? Yeah. I mean, what is that after hearing confessions for almost 60 years? What is that like?
Oh, I loved every minute of it.
Really?
Because I felt I was helping people in some way, even if they're little children, There's nothing like the first graders who confess their little sins, and you have to, help them along. And it can be a bit boring after a while if you've got 70 of them, etc.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, then there are, I hear, my own confreres, my religious confreres, and I feel like I'm giving them a service when they're discouraged or when they're, they're having troubles and difficulties. But if they're novices or students or sisters that are having problems, you're trying to help them, giving them encouragement. Yeah. It's primarily a sacrament of encouragement psychologically. Yeah. Yeah. Objectively, it's a sacrament that really takes away sin. So you could be an idiot in terms of being able to explain anything. You may have terrible manners, but once you get absolution, the sins disappear. But that's not the only thing that can take place with the sacrament. It's a form of preaching.
Now, I've heard that on your deathbed that demons can actually tempt people towards despair at that very last moment.
Can happen, yeah.
Now, do the demons lose a memory of your sins after they've been forgiven? Or do they see that you did it and they always did it? So they're able to bring that stuff back up to you.
Oh, I would say that they're not stupid. Sure, they will. If they're after your soul, they can see, well, here's his weak spot, and so they can. Yeah, that's very easy for them to remember. That's not a problem.
Now, is it? Have you found? I've heard a lot of priests say that when they walk out of that confessional, there is almost a grace in that they kind of goes out of their mind and they're able to set it aside and they don't think about what they heard. It doesn't bring them down. They just can kind of compartmentalize it, or there's a grace that just kind of swipes it out. What's your experience with that?
Oh, I'd say sometimes, maybe most of the times, I forget about it. Once in a great while, I might be discouraged if I've been unable to get somebody to confess their sins, to make penance, and maybe not. And it depends, because when I was younger, I was more emotional. I mean, I felt things a little more emotionally than I do now. But I generally, I generally forget stuff. And of course, I'm not a regular confessor like in a parish. I'm an extraordinary confessioner. Not that I'm extraordinary, but we call them
extraordinary.
When you just occasionally you have to do it. Like for example, during Lent, we always get invited to go to parishes, etc., and we do that. And you hear them for 4 hours, sometimes 3 hours. When I give a parish a mission. I heard 19 hours of confessions.
Oh my goodness!
But it didn't. I didn't start brooding about them.
Right.
You just did the work.
Right.
Did the work. But you can, when you're younger, you can brood a little bit. Or if you don't have a solution. But even then, you shouldn't worry about it. What you do is you just try to find what the solution is and then tell the penitent afterward to call you and then give the solution.
Right. Interesting. Now, just final statement, I'd like you to comment, because this book is so rich on the virtues and vices and people striving to live holy lives. And I remember there was there's a divide in the church, not good words, but conservative, liberal divide, again, imperfect terms, but there's just a divide just about on darn near everything in the church, it seems. And then I think it was Australia, which is a very leftist kind of country, that there was a legislative motion to force priests to break the seal of confession if they heard things about child abuse or something to that effect, making it legal. And what struck me, Father, was even the most liberal of priests, the most progressive, the most leftist, the most heterodox of priests completely rejected that legislative act. And it was so quite beautiful to see all priests united around that idea. Like they can't agree on anything else. You follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
They can't agree on anything else. But when it comes to that, there must be a grace that's flowing to these priests, no matter where they are on the political spectrum. There must be a grace when they are willing. They might be pro-choice, they might be all these kind of crazy things, and they will go to prison before they break the seal of confession.
Well, that we don't know yet.
Well, I just find, at least that
they'll say they will.
They claim, but even the fact that they claim it is a beautiful thing.
That's true.
It shows something special about this sacrament.
That's true.
That transcends political lines.
That's true.
All of that.
And then we have some saints whose tongues are incorrupt because of that. They suffered martyrdom.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. I 10 years ago, I could have given you his name, but right now it's...
Well, your memory has been amazing. And this discussion for me has been not just fun, but informative and inspiring and encouraging. Like you were saying, confession is primarily, I didn't go to confession, but it's encouraging. So your whole priesthood, your scholarship, your leadership in the church has been remarkable, and I hope the listeners of this, can further appreciate what you've done. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, if I've done anything, I hope they'll pray for me.
We'll do that.
If I have 10 more years to go, I want to have a clear mind.
All right, every single person that listens to this is the calling. As soon as this turns off, say a prayer for Father Basil Cole, and all the wonderful things that you've been doing in the church for all these many, many years, and many more years hopefully to come. So God bless you, Father. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.